This is the summary of Field Notes from a Catastrophe, Man, Nature, and Climate Change by Elizabeth Kolbert. Introduction. It's hard for many of us to grasp what's at stake when it comes to climate change. We hear about dramatic weather events, natural disasters, melting glaciers, and forest fires caused by drought. We know that the planet has warmed enough to wreak havoc on animal populations, weather patterns, and fragile ecosystems. Yet it's still hard to understand the scope of what's changing in the world and what our role is in making things better for the future. In this book, author Elizabeth Kolbert takes us to several locations that are experiencing major disruptions due to climate change. Her goal is to bring the reality of climate change to the forefront of our minds, to bring us the research, stories, and images that show the impacts of climate change on a global scale. Through her trip around the world, she attempts to document the effects she finds. Her message is this: we are altering the atmosphere, we know what we're doing, and we can do something about it. The question is, will we? As a critical threshold approaches, the world continues to get warmer and warmer, and we may not be able to go back. Although that's a frightening prospect, we can't let fear excuse our inaction. We can't let this important issue become politicized and buried in resistance to truth. Nature, a warmer sky. The first destination from Kolbert's Field Notes on climate change is the Alaskan village of Shishmaref, population 591. An ancient Native American outpost near the land bridge that once linked Asia and North America, this tiny island has been populated for many generations. But in recent decades, due to melting ice and rising seas, the village must relocate to survive. Too many homes are flooding or being swept away by rising waters. The inhabitants must now decide how to move to the mainland. One of the first major studies of global warming took place in 1979. The National Academy of Sciences led the effort, along with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and NASA. This was one of the first times humankind's asked about the results of adding carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere. The research found some alarming results: appreciable climate change had already begun. The entire planet, including the oceans, was heating up. Nearly every subsequent year has been hotter than the year before it, oceans are becoming more acidic, plants are blooming in different cycles, and animals are migrating toward Earth's poles. Permafrost plays a significant role in the acceleration of global warming. When a piece of ground has been frozen for at least 2 years straight, it's categorized as permafrost, which can range from a few hundred to a few thousand feet deep. The effects of melting permafrost are significant because permafrost is a repository of greenhouse gases. As it melts, it releases into the air the very gases that are causing it to melt, setting in motion a vicious cycle of rapid melting. In the Arctic, the process of permafrost melting and releasing its greenhouse gases is already underway, and researchers are measuring record-breaking outputs of methane and carbon dioxide leaking from the melting ground. If the entire permafrost were to melt, it would release up to 450 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. The Arctic's perennial sea ice has shrunk dramatically over the past few decades, wiping out an area the size of Texas, New York, and Georgia combined. The release of greenhouse gases is especially significant because they prevent Earth's radiation from flowing freely out to space. Instead, they absorb some of this radiation, locking it in the atmosphere and thus increasing its temperature. The more gases are released, the warmer the atmosphere becomes. But we're not only seeing the melting of permafrost and the shrinking of sea ice, we're also discovering the ways global warming is impacting animal populations. Research shows that changing weather patterns are causing butterflies to shift their ranges northward, and some species of frogs have begun mating 10 days earlier than normal. Dozens of other changes are occurring in plant and animal species around the world as they attempt to adapt to altered climate conditions. In this way, global warming is spurring evolutionary processes and changes in genetic codes. Man, floating houses. There's no question that the industrialization of the modern world, facilitated by the consumption of fossil fuels, has dramatically increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Research shows that these levels have risen from 280 parts per million to 378 parts per million since pre-industrial times, and methane concentration has more than doubled. One major effect of these increased levels of gases in the atmosphere is rising sea levels. Water expands when it warms, and sea levels are predicted to rise up to 3 feet in the next century. But even if we're able to stabilize levels of atmospheric gases, that won't stop sea levels from rising for the next few centuries because it will take extra time for the ocean's thermal expansion to occur. In the meantime, changing weather patterns create increased precipitation, adding even more water to the equation. While some regions will experience less rainfall, others will see much more. Kolbert explores this further in the Netherlands, where engineers are already preparing for land to be inundated by building floating houses. How much are we contributing to the problem? Kolbert provides some helpful statistics. The energy used by the average American releases 12,000 pounds of carbon per year. Each gallon of gas used sends 5 pounds of carbon into the atmosphere, and a kilowatt-hour of electricity from a coal-fired plant releases half a pound of carbon into the atmosphere. Scientists have created dozens of models for how to limit emissions and scale back carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, but all agree that a multi-point approach is necessary. Humans must cut back on the levels of energy we currently use, cars must be driven less and become twice as efficient, and sources of energy must shift to renewables. In addition, carbon capture technology, which can remove carbon from the air and store it underground, must become widespread. But as highly industrialized nations scale back their carbon emissions with more efficient fuel sources and technological advances, some rapidly developing nations, such as China and India, are adding hundreds of coal-fired plants. In the United States, intense lobbying from the fossil fuel industry has succeeded in delaying meaningful action on climate change. Neither of the Bush presidencies would commit to worldwide accords calling for nations to take specific steps toward reducing carbon emissions. President Clinton, who gave speeches on global warming, allowed carbon emissions to climb more than 15% while he was in office. Disinformation from special interest groups and withdrawal from collective worldwide agreements allow the U.S. to remain the world's largest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases by far, responsible for a total of 25% of the world's emissions. Kolbert says that it's crucial to understand that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere sets off other critical actions, such as the permafrost melting that dramatically accelerates the release of greenhouse gases. Even if today's levels of carbon dioxide were to remain steady, the ongoing effects of previous emissions would still cause changing weather patterns, melting glaciers, and rising temperatures for decades to come. Time, the island and the wind. We now know that major stretches of ancient ice are melting away, and as they retreat, more seawater comes in and speeds up the melting process. In 2014, researchers found that the West Antarctic ice sheet was collapsing and that its complete disintegration was inevitable. In the Arctic, sea ice has been melting even more quickly than climate models predict. In light of these facts, it can be hard to understand why certain populations continue to resist the truth about climate change. Recent studies have shown that one's beliefs about climate change research are connected to a sense of group identity. Democrats overwhelmingly believe that climate change is a solvable, human-made problem, while only a small percentage of Republicans agree. Those on both sides who are concerned feel too guilty or helpless to talk to others, as it seems unpleasant and confrontational. Kolbert suggests that the only way to overcome this political and individual gridlock is for national leaders to speak openly about global warming and encourage people across the political spectrum to join together and make changes. The consequences of inaction are already revealing themselves. In addition to the rapidly melting ice sheets, the oceans are absorbing much of the carbon from the air, nearly 2 billion tons a year. As the oceans take in more carbon, they become substantially more acidic, resulting in the bleaching of coral and eroding of animal shells. This will contribute to the eventual erasure of vital ecosystems. These changes also affect the food chain, resulting in the collapse of fisheries and a proliferation of toxic algal blooms. In addition, millions of acres of forests in the US and Canada are dying from beetle infestations brought on by warmer weather. Living things on land and sea affect one another, and altering the chemistry of the air and sky is already affecting the food we eat and the water we drink. The disruptive impacts of climate change are accelerating, with the Arctic ice cap losing an expanse the size of West Virginia every year. Meanwhile, China is building roughly 4 new coal-fired plants each month, with the capacity to release billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and the US continues to outpace the world in current emissions. Conclusion. After taking us through decades of climate research, Kolbert offers a look at a few communities that embrace the challenge of tackling global emissions at the local level. In Burlington, Vermont, most businesses and citizens undergo voluntary energy assessments and then comply with plans to drastically reduce their energy use. Local businesses also invest in renewable energy sources that keep costs down. In Samso, Denmark, residents collectively buy wind turbines and install new, energy-efficient heating systems in their homes. In Switzerland, people started the 2000-watt society, with guidelines on how each person can live comfortably using only 2000 kilowatts of energy per year. In each case, global concerns are tackled with local ingenuity and a collective commitment to transforming energy consumption. In closing, Kolbert points out three main elements that will determine how we move forward in the future: societal decisions, technical innovation, and personal resolve to live in a climate-conscious way.